everyone. This is the Next Best Picture podcast, and today I am joined by the star of The Brutalist, Alessandro Nivola. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I've seen the film twice. I adore it. I think I've said before, I think it's personally the film of the decade so far that really encapsulates, just everything in terms of filmmaking in general and what's happening in society. I recently had the pleasure of talking to Adrien Brody, and he mentioned uh, inspirations and stories he drew from his family and how those eventually bled into his performance. This role is also very close to home for you. You have Jewish ancestry in your family. Your grandfather was an artist who immigrated to America to continue his work. I'm curious if you felt also the same and how those inherent ties ultimately bled into your work and your performance of the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the thing that was most easily identifiable was this attempt to assimilate into a foreign culture and the ways that that can create insecurity and I mean, the character I was playing is somebody who's tried so hard to become an American and doesn't quite succeed. And it's the sort of near miss of that is the source of his insecurity and weakness. And it's something that's very familiar to me in my own family for sure. My dad's name was Pietro Salvatore Nivola, and all through high school he went by Pete. And being a first generation American, he was longing to be accepted and to fit in, and I think that created a kind of, I mean, it was destabilizing for him. So it was interesting to explore that in the character. I watched a lot of interviews with Hungarian immigrants just to try, because his voice was very important. It's even mentioned in the script that people talk about him kind of having a slightly strange sound, and he's almost completely Americanized, but there's sort of something off about it. And I was listening to this guy. There are a lot of, it turns out, Hungarian cinematographers, and one of them, who is a guy named Andrew Lazslo, who shot the original Shogun series and also that cult film, The Warriors. Interesting guy. And as I was listening to these interviews with him, he really had that sound of kind of an urban American Northeast, like New York, Philadelphia kind of accent, but that just had these kind of this color of leftover of the Hungarian. And he had in fact changed his name to Andrew Lazslo from Lazslo Andras. And in my character in the movie, his last name is Mulnar, and he has changed it to Miller. And so that he kind of became the model for the character, just in terms of behavior and voice and stuff. I listened to a lot of interviews with him and basically just mimicked the sound of his accent and voice and speech patterns. But for sure, apart from my dad's experience, my grandmother was a German Jewish Holocaust refugee, and then just as a kind of strange coincidence, my grandfather, who was an abstract expressionist sculptor and had moved here in the 50s, was really best friends with one of the most famous architects and a guy widely considered to be the father of brutalism, which is what the title of the movie takes its name from. And his name was Le Corbusier. And I grew up, he had stayed a lot at my family's house. And in fact, these two huge murals on the walls in the middle of my grandparents' house where he had painted in this kind of classic brutalist Le Corbusier style. And since I was very young child, I grew up just that being kind of part of my everyday life there. So my first conversation with Brady had had a lot to draw on from my personal history for sure.
I love how you mentioned assimilation. I also have the same thing with my dad. You know, we're Puerto Rican. His name's Roberto, but to everyone, it's Bobby. He's always Bob or Bobby or something in that vein. And I think that desperation and insecurity that drives from assimilation is so fascinating with your character, seeing what he's willing to chip away of what his true self. You mentioned his last name, his religion. He switches to Catholicism. Uh, it is heartbreaking in a way. I'm concerned. You mentioned the screenplay and what you took from Brady and Mona's words. I'm curious, when you approach the character, do you only concern yourself with what's given on the page, or do you think about the what ifs? Like, who was Attila before he immigrated to America? Was he a happier man? Was he less aggressive? What is he not willing to give away of himself compared to what he actually does? Do you ever have those questions float in your mind, or at the point of filming, you're only just like, what's in front of me? Because there's plenty of actors, their method is what's here is here. I don't tend to think about what happens after. I don't tend to think about what before, but I'm curious from your perspective.
Oh God, I don't know any actors who don't think about what's before and after. Of course, the text is like is meant to provide all kinds of clues, but it's all about kind of creating a world for yourself in your imagination and having it be as detailed and specific as possible, because it just that's that's part of the joy of it, really. I, yes, I mean, I had a whole world, a whole life of this character in my head, most of which was taken from little suggestions that the script made, but that remained mysterious in the script. And a big clue for me was the history of the relationship with Lazslo, who was his cousin, who Adrien plays. And in the sort of final scene between the two of us, I make reference to something that happened romantically between him and a girlfriend of mine when we were younger. And I've accused him of sleeping with my wife now. And I say something like, why should I be surprised? You did it once, why wouldn't you do it again, kind of thing. And to me, I mean, that opened up a whole line of inquiry about their relationship when they were younger. And um, I think I think that Attila really loved Lazslo, loves him as family. They've grown up together, very close, I think, almost like brothers. I think the family was probably closely knit at home. I think they spent a lot of time together, and I think he was very competitive with Lazslo at the same time, and both in awe of his talent and genius, which I'm sure was apparent when they were younger, and also jealous and resentful of it. And also jealous and resentful of his kind of charm and ease and confidence and almost arrogance with everybody, but probably with women also. And so something happened where I imagine he slept with my girlfriend. And, that was just a sort of one manifestation of a lot of kind of competition and sort of simmering aggression between the two of them that existed before this moment. Now, on the other hand, Attila has come to this country 10 years before Lazslo has, and in doing so, I have managed to avoid all the real trauma of the Holocaust. And when I first meet Lazslo, he's just come out of the camps. And I think Attila has just like deep-seated guilt about having avoided the camps when Lazslo has endured it. And I think it makes him feel emasculated and ashamed of himself, even though, of course, like, he wouldn't wish it on anybody, not even himself. But I think given what Laszlo's just come through, he sort of looks at him almost heroically for it. And so, this relationship is just so complicated because of all those things. There's real love, real like blood bond between them. There's like a real physicality in their relationship, and there's both idolatry and resentment and rage. So all that, like, I had in my head, I don't know how much of it the audience gleans. Hopefully they just instinctively sort of sense a lot of those things. The script hints at some of them, but they're drawn in great detail in my mind.
I mean, a lot of it is, I felt a lot of it was conveyed, especially the first scene you and Adrien have together, that reunion at the bus stop. I mean, again, like for those who are listening, uh, there's only a certain portion of the film you're in, but your impact is so, I think, fundamental in establishing not only the events of the story, but the blueprint of how Lazlo slowly evolves as well. And I just like, especially that bus scene, you get a lot just from that opening moments. I'm curious, a production of this, not a huge budget, this grandness, this scope it has. Was there a lot of rehearsal that went to it, especially like that moment? I think is incredibly pivotal.
No rehearsal.
Wow.
Yeah, that moment was, yeah, I mean, I remember it really vividly filming it now. Adrien and I had never worked together, and we'd never met each other. Not before, we'd done a few scenes before we did that scene, but we'd never met before arriving in Budapest where we shot the movie. And we had a lot of friends in common and things, but we didn't know each other. But from the get-go, we were very tactile with each other and not careful around each other at all. And that was good because it felt like, neither one of us were like tiptoeing around the other. We really felt like we could treat each other like we had a family history. That scene, nobody really said anything going into it. I think we both instinctively knew like what a big moment it was, just because of what Lazlo had just been through. I mean, you have to imagine he'd been to hell and back. And I had this piece of information that his wife is still alive. And the moment was just inevitably going to be just so emotionally full because of my awareness of what he'd gone through, my own sort of shame at not having gone through it, my longing to kind of create a safe place for him and invite him into my world, and at the same time feeling like I wanted him to be impressed by me and think that I'm a success, even though I'm not really, and all of that. And then for him, of course, just like that's the moment where he finally can let down and feel like he's arrived someplace where he can start a new life. And so all of that, we just knew that's what was behind it, but nobody said anything. That was a scene that was shot on VistaVision, and those VistaVision cameras are very, very loud, and they have the magazine running sideways as opposed to vertically. They're horizontal, and you hear the whir of the film going through so loud that it's almost like the sound, I think, usually not usable in the scenes that are shot in VistaVision because it's just like, and so it was just like everything was heightened and the camera was going and he got off the bus and it just all kind of happened the way that it happened. And I think maybe we did it twice and that was it.
That's unreal to think that a scene like that of that magnitude was pulled off in just two takes. I
And
think
also,
all,
I was speaking fucking
yeah,
Hungarian.
which is just unreal. Um, I think what's also great about your work in The Brutalist is that you also had the pleasure of working with the great Pedro Almodovar in The Room Next Door, and there's this interesting through line between those two characters of various displays of hypermasculinity in men in America, and like whether it is played for laughs like in The Room Next Door to a degree or for a more emotionally wrenching perspective in The Brutalist. I'm curious, and I'm under the assumption you filmed Brutalist first and Room Next Door, going to that stylistic difference, especially on Maestro Almodovar's wavelength. What was that like to maintain that, especially when you're playing off against, someone like Julianne Moore and also in his first English film? I felt like there has to be some innate pressure that comes with that.
Yeah, I mean, the big challenge with the scene in The Room Next Door was that so he Almodovar, I should say. He creates worlds that kind of exist outside of reality. They're hyper real. They're very stylized. They have a kind of I mean, just the colors and everything. They're not usually clearly rooted in a time and place that's very, very specific. It's more like the time and place of his wild imagination. And yet, the character that he wrote that I was playing and the circumstances of the scene and the role that the character was playing in this telling of the story depended on him actually being very specifically from an area of upstate New York and from a culture, a working class culture where he was probably from a history of law enforcement and who happened to be very religious. So I was faced with the challenge of creating a character that was specifically rooted in that place and at the same time would fit into the kind of world that is unique to Pedro. I grew up in northern Vermont, just across Lake Champlain, from sort of not far from where those scenes would have been set, and where this character would have been from. And so I knew what people sounded like, and what their voices were like, and I'd been around I'd gone to school with a lot of people like him, and so I decided that I was going to just play it for real and be as detailed and specific about who that guy was and where he was from, and it being a real time and place, and him having a real set of experiences, and then hope that somehow it would fit. And interestingly, so even just for that one sequence, Pedro flew me over to Madrid. The scene is set in upstate New York, and we shot it on sound stages in Madrid. So he flew me over to Madrid for a week to rehearse with Julianne, almost like a month before we were actually going to shoot the scene. And so then I ended up flying back to New York and then came again the second time to shoot. And in that week, I had all these fittings and things. And originally, he had me dressed in like a really sort of beautifully tailored suit with like a pink tie and all this stuff. It was very like Almodovar style. And as I was kind of, after I went back home and was researching interrogations in New York State, in detective interrogations in New York State, I just started seeing everybody looked exactly the same. They were all dressed in these black polos with khaki pants and like sneakers or whatever. And so I sent him a lot of pictures that I'd like pulled off of YouTube footage and stuff. And I said, "Hey, listen, you may have a particular vision and production design, and I know everything's going to be fitting in with the color scheme of the thing." And I didn't even know at the time, but like one chair is blue and one chair is red and all that kind of thing. But I just said, for what it's worth, this is the real thing, and it's up to you if you want to kind of go that route or not. And he wrote back saying, "Oh, thank you so much. Like, I will think about it." You know what I mean? And so I was like, okay. And I flew over there still not knowing what I was going to be wearing, if I was going to be in this like pink tie and like a sort of Armani suit or whatever, or if I was going to be the real guy. And to me, that, which way that went was going to tell me whether he kind of was giving me license to be that real person in his world, or if he was telling me, no, you need to be this sort of archetypal character who is the sort of, a sort of invented version of a policeman who's like, not necessarily a real person. And I didn't know, even walking onto set the first day, what was going to be hanging in my dressing room. And I got there, and like down to every last detail of the pictures that I'd sent was that costume that I had sent him. And that just told me that he was, wanting me to do it the way that I had been researching and working on it. And I got in there. I'd never been so prepared in my life. And we did it in one take.
Well, as someone who's seen it, I can say that you run that line, perfectly. It works really well. It was delightful to see your work with Pedro Almodovar and with Brady, and both of these films. They're two very different yet unique performances. I urge everyone who's listening to go see it. Alessandro, I know you're very busy, so I just want to say thank you so much for your time.
Hey, nice to talk to you, and look forward to seeing you again soon.